we're clearly hop, skipping, and jumping around the social sciences, but I hope that the connections and the common themes and utility of the methods that we use are starting to emerge here already this morning. Our final presenter in the panel is Cristina Mora, who is an assistant professor of sociology at UC Berkeley. Her research focuses on racial and ethnic categorization, organization, immigration. She also studies immigration and religion. Her new book, Making Hispanics, just published last year by Chicago, describes the construction and influence of the Hispanic-Latino pan-ethnic category in the U.S., and she's currently working on a comparative analysis of Latino political organizations in the U.S. and Spain. Cristina.
All right, so just press slideshow. All right, great. Thanks very much for the invitation. It's my first time here at Davis, and it feels great. And, you know, just sitting here this morning with a great breakfast, I feel there's a lot of, it feels like there's a lot of excitement in the air around ISSI, and that's really quite inspiring. So I congratulate you on this, and I'm looking forward to the future of ISSI here. Okay, my work is about the development of the Hispanic category in the United States. And to begin, I'd like you to consider what America looked like in the late 1960s. Specifically, if one could peek into the field of social movements, one would find images like this. Activists in the Southwest shouted Chicano power and led protests to draw attention to poverty and education issues. In the Northeast, Puerto Ricans used protests to highlight issues of Puerto Rican sovereignty and community development. And in Miami, political groups were focused on denouncing Castro and the developments of the Cuban Revolution. So what developed was, for the most part, a pattern of disparate political communities. Mexicans organized Mexicans in the Southwest, Puerto Ricans organized co-ethnics in the Northeast, and Cubans did the same in Miami. And we might think that in other sectors, perhaps like the market, we'd find much more pan-ethnic connectivity. But if we look at commercial television, we find this same pattern. TV guide listings show that Spanish-language stations in the Southwest broadcasted several hours of Mexican programming. Puerto Rican entrepreneurs in New York imported soap operas, comedies, and other shows made in San Juan. And entrepreneurs in Miami rented studios and made their own shows for Cuban-American audiences. But America in 1990 looks much different. First, several of the major Chicano organizations evolved by attracting Puerto Rican and Cuban constituents and lobbying on behalf of Hispanic civil rights. By 1990, Univision, the nation's largest Spanish-language network, delivers the same programming to Mexican, Cuban, and Puerto Rican audiences. And last, but equally important, by 1990, there's a new census category. It's called Hispanic, which consolidates these communities into one statistical meta-group. So how did this shift occur? Well, journalists have argued that this change happened as part of a shift in self-identification. They contend that as migration increased, that Latinos somehow began forming a pan-ethnic outlook. But the available data that exists suggests that Hispanic self-identification increased, but only after the establishment of Hispanic social movements, television networks, and the census category. And while up until last year, there was no book that told the story of the rise of the Hispanic category, previous research had posited some suggestions or explanations for the case. The majority pointed to the state, arguing that census officials simply imposed the category in order to gather more accurate information on Latin American migration. Others pointed to a sort of ethnic mobilization theory to argue that it was political leaders who popularized the category in order to join the resources of their communities. Last, others pointed to the market. They noted that commercial television creates mass images that homogenizes the distinctiveness of Latin American groups. In effect, these accounts provided really a sort of additive model of pan-ethnicity, which assumed that the shift occurred as a sum of disparate parts. As a result, we know little about the relational mechanisms that might have accounted for the shift, even though prominent theories on classification suggest that categories emerge relationally. What my work does is examine changes in organizations. I focused on how four main organizations, a committee in the Office of the President, an activist group, the Census Bureau, and a Spanish-language TV firm adopted the Hispanic category. And at first, I thought I'd simply document separate changes. I actually thought this was going to be 4 case studies of sort of changes in organizational identity. But as I dove into the archives, I realized that these entities shifted not independently, but rather in deep relation to one another. That is, the Census Bureau adopted a Hispanic category as activist groups, and the Office of the President adopted pan-ethnic agendas and language, and as media firms experimented with pan-ethnic programming. And so I began tracing these changes as they emerged in relationship across field. And so the project is historical and draws on several data sources. And what my work generally argues is that Hispanic pan-ethnicity emerged from a pattern of cross-field effects, wherein developments in one sector sparked and accelerated changes in another. At the broadest level, the effects look like this. First, Mexican American and Puerto Rican activists protested the Census Bureau, demanding better data. At the time, activists were motivated by the Black Civil Rights Movement and wanted to pressure the government to provide them with resources. But first, they needed data about unemployment, poverty, and other factors to prove their claim. Back then, the Bureau mainly categorized Mexicans and others as white, thus lumping their data together with Irish, Italians, and several others. And so census reports were useless for Latino activism. The Bureau initially resisted activists, claiming that separate categories for Mexicans and Puerto Ricans would not be statistically reliable. Nonetheless, activists persisted, appealing to bureaucrats in the Johnson and Nixon administration and then to allies in Congress. And in effect, they argued that by not separating Latinos from whites, that the Bureau was, 1, limiting activists' efforts to fight for equality, and 2, they argued that the Bureau was unjustly trying to fit Latinos into a schema that didn't represent them. Specifically, activists argued that the white, black, and traditional Asian categories didn't make sense to Latinos because they were a mixed population that didn't fall neatly into these divides. If anything, some argued that Latinos were a, quote, brown category who deserved their own classification. Allies in the executive office and in Congress responded by pressuring the Bureau to listen to activists. And after much pushback, the Bureau assessed the issue. But instead of agreeing to create separate Mexican and Puerto Rican categories, the Bureau instead created an umbrella Hispanic category that would cover all Latin American groups. Yet was still this pernicious question about race. The Bureau had a difficult time with this because of 2 main issues. First was the inconclusiveness of the research. In the mid-1970s, the Bureau sent anthropologists out to ask whether Latinos would consider themselves as white or as something else. In an interview with the former census official, she noted, "One study deemed the Spanish origin a separate race, especially if you considered the Mexican Americans. But others found them to be white, especially if you considered Cubans in Florida." The second issue concerned pushback from other groups. See, when the Bureau included Hispanic category in the race question during pre-census trials and thus forced individuals to choose if they were, for instance, Hispanic or black, well, the number of blacks dropped. So in an interview with the former census officials, he recalled a critical meeting where the Bureau discussed the issue of race. He states, "The census director spoke of the danger of including the Hispanic category as a racial one. He knew he'd get complaints from blacks if their numbers went down overall, and you had to think about the Puerto Ricans. This was a real possibility. Not to mention the Native American numbers in the Southwest, and there was even the fear that Filipinos in California would choose Hispanic over Asian, and we'd get it from all 3 groups. And this fear of other groups, especially African Americans, was real. Indeed, in 1977, the Bureau even led a discussion forum with members of the NAACP to assure them that the new Hispanic category would not be a racial one, and that the number of Hispanics would not surpass the number of African Americans in 1980. So in the end, the activists never pushed the race or ethnicity question much further. And so a separate Hispanic category began to emerge in the mid-70s in a variety of small census reports. And the Hispanic data served as an important resource for social movements and media firms alike. The Hispanic data helped media because they could now use it to show advertisers that Hispanic viewers numbered in the million. And in the third step, activists, census officials, and media executives worked together to popularize the idea of a Hispanic identity, not simply to create a Hispanic category, but to create a narrative about a Hispanic identity. And just to show you how important the census was for media executives, as soon as the data came out, media began to create marketing reports about the national Hispanic market. So this was the first manual, and it was published soon after the release of census data in 1980. It and other manuals had statements like these. The Census Bureau shows that Hispanics are a growing population. They have larger families than other groups, and the median age is younger. And since we know that they are family-oriented, at the very least, the numbers mean that they will purchase more diapers and more household products than other groups. And so, of course, executives jumped at the chance to help the Census Bureau popularize the new category. They created an entire media strategy around the 1980 census with commercials, talk show segments, and even a short documentary that described the new Hispanic category and implored viewers to identify with it. And as mentioned, social movement groups also helped the Bureau publicize the category. This is a copy of one of the flyers that they passed out in town halls across the country. It says, "We're united, we're Hispanics." And so my book posits the notion of cross-field effects for explaining the Hispanic category, and it argues that these effects are undergirded by three main factors. We can understand the rise of this category in three ways. First is the emergence of new resources. The example I use here is how census data served as a resource that motivates pan-ethnicity in the social movement field and also in the media field. Second, the effects are undergirded by the rise of networks, wherein organizations that normally would have not worked together learned how to do so. So, for example, activists eventually began hiring media executives as consultants to help them solicit money from corporations that were already advertising on Hispanic television. And over time, activists were hired as political analysts and commentators to star in Spanish-language media news programming. The third mechanism is the use of ambiguity. Ambiguity is important because organizations originally developed frames that suited their needs. In their grant applications, activists depicted Hispanics as an underrepresented and disadvantaged minority that lacked resources and opportunities. The Census Bureau depicted Hispanics as a group that was united by a set of quantifiable and correlated attributes. And of course, media firms depicted Hispanics as consumers, as an up-and-coming and untapped lucrative market. And so over time, as organizations began working together, they began to also use one another's frames. So as activists used media executives as consultants, they began to also speak about Hispanics as consumers. So for example, this is a solicitation letter that Hispanic groups sent out to corporations. It read exactly like this. Everybody's talking about it. The Hispanic market. Enough talk. Stand up and participate. Contribute to NCLR. A contribution to us is an effective way of reaching Hispanics and building goodwill for your product or service. The idea was that a contribution to a Hispanic cause could translate into Hispanic consumer dollars. And media organizations use Hispanics as a disadvantaged, underrepresented minority frame to convince the FCC to provide them with special market exemptions based on the fact that Spanish-language media served a minority population. So this is an example from a set of FCC hearings about minority ownership. And you'll see organizations shared each other's frames. In front of the FCC, Univision stated, Spanish-language audiences are one of the most underserved and isolated groups in America. Their communities lack resources, including news and information outlets. Univision serves a public interest by providing for the needs of this disadvantaged population. But we must think, perhaps, that managing these different frames is difficult. If we think of activists, on the one hand, they argued to state agencies and grant-making agencies that Hispanics were poor, underrepresented, and disadvantaged. On the other hand, these same organizations argued to corporations that Hispanics were an untapped, lucrative market. And the only way it was possible to reconcile these two frames was if organizations began to appeal to a broader, more ambiguous understanding of Hispanic. A more ambiguous understanding that could link the competing frames together by emphasizing culture. So over time, as organizations interacted, they developed a narrative about Hispanic culture. They argued that Hispanics were all Hispanic because they were religious, hardworking, and had family values. Vague concepts that could be applied to most any group. So for example, like other organizations, the Census Bureau never provided an exact definition of Hispanic. Instead, they described what ultimately made Hispanic in abstract terms. And so this is an excerpt from a 1985 report. It says, Hispanics can trace their roots in the Americas back 5 centuries. They share a common heritage, common values, and a common mother tongue. These and other ties unite them from east to west, north to south. So we see pan-ethnicity here is vaguely defined. And as organizations worked together, what emerged was a sort of new plausibility structure, where organizations developed a vested interest in maintaining the notion of pan-ethnicity across social arenas. So activists and the Census Bureau together petitioned vital statistics offices across the country to create a new Hispanic category on birth certificates, thus spreading the identity across the nation. And moreover, organizations drew on each other's frames, effectively legitimating them in other sectors. Social movements brought the frame of Hispanics as a consumer into the broader civic sector, making that available to new and emerging civic groups. Additionally, the language of Hispanics as a minority became available to new and emerging media firms. But these otherwise contradictory representations could hang together because the idea of Hispanic pan-ethnicity becomes defined as vague, abstract, and taken for granted. And by 1990, what emerges is a collection of diverse organizations from state agencies to social movement groups to media firms that became invested in maintaining Hispanic pan-ethnicity largely because their interests interlocked. They claimed Hispanics were a minority, that they were consumers, that they were a statistical category because above all, they shared some kind of ambiguous common culture. And so I think that a shared investment in ambiguity to this day really is at the core of the Hispanic category. Ambiguity allows for different individuals and organizations to project their own interpretation of the identity and makes the category expansive and still powerful. Thank you.